In America, what separates immigrants from their new lives isn't the border, it's the language. And within these communities, an interpreter is far more than someone providing a service. They're often the only person people feel they can trust. The woman at the center of today's story had spent more than 20 years doing exactly that. In early September 2011, she received a call offering her an interpreting job. She drove away from her home before sunrise and never returned. The most painful twist in this case is that the very trust she placed in her profession was turned into a weapon against her. And the killer was the person she loved with all her heart. The story takes place in Illinois, in the Midwestern United States. She lived in Crest Hill, a small town in the southwestern suburbs of Chicago. The destination of her final journey was Bloomington, about 80 miles from her home and more than 2 hours away by car. In America, freelance interpreters often have no choice but to travel long distances to meet clients they've never met before. A client calls, arranges a meeting place, and pays them by the day. It's completely normal in that line of work. The woman's name was Linda Tyda, and in 2011, she was 70 years old. She'd been born in China and immigrated to the United States more than 20 years earlier, bringing her young son with her after her first marriage fell apart. Mother and son chose the Chicago area as the place where they would build a new life. For a woman already in her 40s, with no close relatives, no savings, and arriving in a completely unfamiliar country, the only thing she had to rely on was language, and she turned it into an entire career. In the beginning, she took on all kinds of small interpreting jobs. She translated documents, interpreted during hospital appointments, and helped newly arrived families who were still too afraid to venture beyond their own neighborhoods. Word spread, and more people began turning to her for help. Eventually, she founded her own interpreting company and became a business owner. Her work was never confined to an air-conditioned office. She accepted assignments that many others were reluctant to take, including interpreting at a federal prison, where she sat face-to-face with Chinese inmates and conveyed their words. She also helped new immigrants complete visa paperwork, accompanied them while they searched for homes, and carefully read every line of their contracts so they wouldn't be taken advantage of. She even refused payment from families who were struggling too much to afford her services. Within Chicago's Chinese community, the name Linda Tyda had become almost synonymous with trust. Ask 10 people about her, and all 10 would say that she was kind, generous, and always willing to put aside her own responsibilities to help someone else. She was the kind of person every immigrant community needs. Despite her age, she had no intention of slowing down. Those who knew her said she was still quick on her feet, and as sharp as ever. To her, age was nothing more than a number. Her personal life had also entered a new chapter. In 2010, she met Larry Tyda through a dating website, and the two quickly found in each other the companionship they'd both been missing for far too long. They married in January 2011, which meant that when our story begins, they'd been husband and wife for only 8 months. The young son she had once brought to America was now a grown man. His name was Don Wang. He was married, had a young son of his own, and lived in Bloomington, where Linda regularly traveled to visit her son and grandson. She had a stable career, a loving family, and had finally found personal happiness again. Had the story ended there, it would have been a beautiful conclusion to one immigrant woman's long journey. But our story was only beginning. Now, let's go back to September 4th, 2011. It was a Sunday. That afternoon, Linda's phone rang. On the other end was an employee from a Chinese restaurant in Bloomington. The caller said that a customer at the restaurant needed to hire a Chinese interpreter for the following day, and the assignment was described in very clear terms. Early the next morning, Linda would drive to Bloomington to pick up the client. The two of them would then travel to Chicago and visit a Chinese language school. Linda would interpret for the client throughout the day before driving them back to Bloomington. She would be paid $500 for the day. For a freelance interpreter, it was an excellent offer. The assignment was specific. The route was clearly laid out. The pay was higher than average, and the work matched her professional expertise. On top of that, Bloomington was where her son lived, a city she'd traveled to countless times over the years. Linda accepted immediately. But she didn't tell anyone about the trip. She didn't message her son, and she gave her husband no further explanation beyond saying that she had an appointment with a client. When you think about it, that was understandable. It was only a one-day assignment. She would leave in the morning and return that evening, just as she'd done hundreds of times before. No one informs their entire family every time they leave home for work. That night, she went to bed early so she could wake before dawn. September 5th, 2011 was a Monday, and the sky was still completely dark. At around 5 in the morning, Linda woke up, gathered her things, and headed out to the car. Before leaving, she kissed her husband on the cheek and told him she'd see him later. Larry was still half asleep, and it felt like an ordinary morning, no different from any other. Her car pulled away from Crest Hill before the town had even begun to wake, and she told her husband she expected to be home sometime between 7 and 8 that evening. Then, the entire day passed in silence. There was no message at noon, and none in the afternoon. But at first, Larry wasn't especially worried because his wife rarely checked her phone while she was working. By 7 that evening, he'd started watching the door. At 8, there was still no sign of her car. He called. No one answered. He sent a text. No reply. 9 o'clock came and went. Then 10. And by then, the silence had become truly unusual. Because Linda was someone who always stayed in touch. No matter how busy she was, she'd call back as soon as she had a free moment. The longer Larry waited, the more anxious he became. Late that night, on September 5th, he finally picked up the phone and called the police. That first call brought no immediate result. Because Linda was an adult and had been gone for less than a full day, Larry was advised to wait a little longer. He spent the entire night waiting, without sleeping for even a moment. By the following morning, September 6th, Linda still hadn't returned, and her phone remained unreachable. At that point, no one could reassure themselves any longer. Police officially opened a missing person case, and the first thing they did was trace the signal from her cell phone. The result left the entire family stunned. The last location from which the phone had transmitted a signal was not Chicago, and it was not Crest Hill. It was Bloomington, the city where her son and daughter-in-law lived. But when police contacted them, both said they had no idea Linda had come to Bloomington. They appeared deeply alarmed. Her daughter-in-law told investigators that she was so worried she could neither eat nor sleep, and that she feared someone might have kidnapped her mother-in-law. A 70-year-old woman had left home at 5 in the morning for a job, then vanished in the very city where members of her family lived, without any of them knowing she was there. So who had Linda gone to Bloomington to meet? Who was the client who had supposedly hired her as an interpreter? And how had a routine one-day assignment turned into a disappearance that left no trace behind? The answer would come only after 7 agonizing days, and it would emerge from a direction none of the investigators had expected. 7 days. That was how long the investigation remained almost completely frozen. As soon as the missing person report was filed, police from both jurisdictions began working together. One team was based in Crest Hill, where Linda lived. The other was in Bloomington, where the signal from her phone had gone silent. Missing person flyers were printed and posted in busy public places. Investigators went door to door in neighborhoods with large Chinese communities. They also worked through Linda's list of former clients, calling each person who had ever hired her to interpret and asking whether anyone had contacted her recently. The search turned up absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, her family was living through hell. Larry rarely moved away from the phone. Linda's son and daughter-in-law in Bloomington kept calling for updates. The only theory anyone could hold on to was that she'd been kidnapped, and perhaps the kidnappers would eventually call to demand a ransom. But that ransom call never came. What came instead, 1 week later, was a phone call no one had expected. The caller was an employee at a Chinese restaurant in Bloomington. He'd seen one of the missing person flyers, and what caught his attention was not the face printed on it, but the line identifying the missing woman's profession, interpreter. He noticed it because he himself had placed the final work-related phone call to Linda. The story he told police began on the afternoon of September 4th. That day, a female customer entered the restaurant. She was neatly dressed and appeared to be well off. She said she needed to hire a Chinese interpreter, but couldn't conveniently make the call herself, so she asked him to call a woman at a phone number she provided. Then she pressed $20 into his hand as a thank you. She had already told him exactly what to say. There was an interpreting job the next morning. The client would be picked up in Bloomington and taken to Chicago, and the payment would be $500. All the employee had to do was repeat the message word for word. To him, it seemed like a harmless favor, and he was being paid for it, so he had no reason to refuse. 7 days later, the woman he had called had disappeared. He also told police that the restaurant had surveillance cameras, and that they were welcome to review the footage at any time. This was the first loose thread. And when police began pulling on it, the entire story started to unravel. They went to the restaurant and obtained the surveillance footage from September 4th. On the screen, the female customer described by the employee appeared clearly. She stood speaking with him, handed him the money, and then left. But when investigators looked closely at her face, they froze. She wasn't a stranger. She was someone they'd already sat across from and interviewed. She was the victim's daughter-in-law, Misook Nowlin Wang. A series of questions immediately followed. If she had simply wanted to meet her mother-in-law, why ask a stranger to make the call? Why pay him? And why invent an entire job involving a client who didn't exist? People hide their identity only when they don't want to be recognized. Police immediately expanded their search for surveillance footage. They went to the location where the supposed meeting had been arranged, a supermarket parking lot in Bloomington. And there, they found a second video. In that footage, Linda's car arrived first. She parked and waited for the client she believed she was about to pick up. A short time later, another vehicle pulled in and parked directly beside her. The person who stepped out was not a client at all. It was Misook. The two women got out of their vehicles and spoke for a while. From their gestures and body language, it was clear that this was not a pleasant conversation. Then, the exchange ended. Each woman returned to her own car and drove away. The crucial detail was that when Linda left that parking lot, she was still alive, and she was still driving her own vehicle. So where did she go next? Misook was summoned to the police station for a second interview, and this time, her attitude hadn't changed at all. She insisted that she had never met her mother-in-law, had no idea why Linda had come to Bloomington, and remained deeply worried about her. The police didn't reveal their evidence right away. While they kept Misook at the station, another team was sent to search her alteration shop. In a trash bin behind the shop, investigators found two things. The first was Linda's ID, cut into numerous pieces. The second was a set of clothes bearing unusual stains. When officers compared them with the surveillance footage from the supermarket parking lot, they immediately confirmed that they were the same clothes Linda had been wearing on her final morning. With her ID shredded and her clothes thrown away, there was no longer any question that Misook had met her. When photographs of the evidence were placed in front of her, Misook finally admitted that she'd invented the interpreting assignment to lure her mother-in-law out. But immediately after making that admission, she offered an entirely different version of what had happened. According to Misook, her relationship with Linda had been strained at the time, and Linda had refused to answer her calls. Misook claimed that she only wanted to meet her, apologize, and make peace, which was why she'd resorted to such a roundabout plan. She said the meeting in the parking lot had failed because Linda became extremely agitated. When the two women separated, Misook claimed that Linda didn't drive home, but instead followed her all the way to the alteration shop. There, Misook claimed, Linda was the one who attacked first. She said she was knocked to the floor and grabbed around the neck, and that when she felt as though she could no longer breathe, she had no choice but to fight back. She said she strangled Linda during the struggle and that she herself then blacked out. When she came to, Linda was lying motionless on the floor. Misook claimed that she panicked, and although she believed she'd acted only in self-defense, she was too afraid to call the police and instead chose to hide the body. On September 13, 2011, 8 days after Linda disappeared, Misook led investigators to a nature preserve in Will County in northern Illinois. There, beneath a thin layer of soil in a shallow grave, they found her. The search was over, but the story of self-defense was beginning to fall apart piece by piece. The autopsy revealed multiple signs of severe blunt force trauma on Linda's body, meaning she'd been struck repeatedly with a hard object before she died. Her cause of death was determined to be complete airway compression. A defensive struggle between two women could not have produced injuries of that kind. Investigators therefore reconstructed the sequence of events differently. Linda had most likely been beaten repeatedly until she was completely unable to resist, and only then strangled until she stopped breathing. And what happened after she died was the most chilling part of the entire case. According to the account later presented by prosecutors in court, Misook hid Linda's body inside the alteration shop, then drove the victim's car back towards Chicago, abandoned it near the airport, and took a bus back to Bloomington. A car left at an airport would make people believe its owner had flown somewhere. After returning, she placed Linda's body inside a large plastic container. That container remained inside the shop throughout the following day, September 6th. On that same day, while police were racing across two cities searching for Linda, Misook continued walking in and out of the shop as though nothing had happened. It wasn't until that evening that she transported the container away and buried the body. There was one final detail, and it completely destroyed the claim of self-defense. Before September 4th, Misook had deliberately arranged for her husband to be out of town for exactly 3 days, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th. Those 3 days covered the entire period from the moment she set up the phone call at the restaurant to the moment the grave was filled in. No one clears 3 days in advance for an accident. That same day, Misook Nowlin Wang was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and concealment of homicidal death. Her bail was set at $100,000. By this point, we knew who had done it and how. But one major question remained unanswered. What could this 70-year-old woman possibly have done to deserve to die? And what had happened between the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law that took them from sharing meals and shopping trips together to a grave in the woods? To answer that question, we need to understand a little more about this daughter-in-law. Misook Nowlin was born in South Korea in 1965, and her childhood began with loss. Her mother died when she was very young, so young that she would later have no memories of her at all. Her father was left alone in desperate poverty, unable to support his daughter, and sent her to live with relatives. But those relatives were hardly any better off. They took her in and raised her, but her education was largely neglected. She grew up dependent on others, passed from one household to another, carrying the feeling that she didn't truly belong anywhere. Something formed inside her during those years, and it would follow her for the rest of her life, a desperate hunger to possess things. Later, once she had some money of her own, she immediately poured it into designer clothes and accessories, as though every expensive item were a patch placed over the emptiness of her childhood. People who knew her said that, to Misook, material abundance was not simply a source of pleasure. It was proof that she had value. In 1987, at the age of 22, she met an American serviceman stationed in South Korea named Andy Nowlin. Their relationship developed quickly, and when Andy completed his military service and returned to the United States in 1988, he brought her with him. They settled in Illinois, married, and had a daughter named Michelle. But the new life was nothing like the sweet future Misook had imagined when she boarded the plane. Andy had to work 2 jobs at once, sometimes as many as 80 hours a week, just to cover the family's expenses. He soon realized that much of that burden came from his own wife. Misook spent money without restraint. On the income of an ordinary working family, the things she purchased were far beyond what they could afford. Andy asked his wife to discuss major expenses with him before spending the money. To him, this was simply what married couples were supposed to do. But Misook saw it as an insult. She felt controlled, looked down on, and treated like a freeloader. Whenever those feelings surfaced, she didn't argue in an ordinary way. She exploded. She smashed objects, screamed, and pushed every conflict as far as it could possibly go until the other person was forced to back down. Andy felt powerless in the face of these rages, and gradually came to understand that the woman he'd brought home from South Korea was nothing like the person he'd first imagined her to be. Then that anger found a new target, one far more vulnerable. In 1998, a teacher at Michelle's school noticed unusual bruises on the child's body and reported them to the authorities. Child welfare records later documented that Misook had struck her daughter with a hard object and had also forcibly restrained her around the face. She was convicted of child abuse and sentenced to 6 months in jail. That same year, the marriage ended. Andy received custody of Michelle while Misook moved out, carrying with her a criminal conviction, a divorce, and nothing else. 5 years later, she entered the life of another family. While working as a Korean-speaking customer service representative at a call center, Misook met a co-worker of Chinese descent named Don Wang. At the time, he was a graduate student working part-time to support himself. He was also the young son Linda had once brought with her from China to the United States. They married in 2003, had a son, and eventually settled in Bloomington. Compared with her first husband, Don Wang was considerably better off. But the person who truly transformed Misook's life was not Don. It was his mother. Linda welcomed her daughter-in-law with an affection that many people described as being almost indistinguishable from the love between a biological mother and daughter. She knew that Misook placed great importance on material comfort, and instead of criticizing her, she indulged her. The two women frequently went out to eat and shop together. Linda bought her designer clothes and expensive handbags and even gave her a Mercedes. Later, she paid to open an alteration shop for Misook, giving her a profession, a place in the world, and something that belonged to her alone. Misook herself told police that Linda had been the mother she'd lacked her entire life. The abandoned child from South Korea finally had everything: a husband, a child, a business, and a mother. Yet even all of that was not enough to fill the emptiness inside her. The first crack appeared because of Don Wang's business. He and 2 other partners invested in a Chinese restaurant, with Don serving as both a shareholder and the manager. But one day, still furious after an argument with her husband, Misook stormed into the restaurant and caused a scene. The 2 business partners couldn't tolerate what happened and decided to force Don out of the operation. Linda had to step in and mediate before the situation finally settled down, but by defending her son, she only ignited a new wave of anger. In Misook's mind, Linda had interfered in her marriage and chosen the other side. From that point on, Linda's attitude toward her daughter-in-law visibly cooled. Their dinners and shopping trips became less frequent, then disappeared altogether. The second crack came from jealousy. Linda had a female assistant of Chinese descent whose responsibilities included helping with the restaurant's operations, so she often had to discuss business with Don Wang. Misook became convinced that her husband and the woman were having an affair. She demanded that Linda intervene and confront her son, but Linda didn't believe the accusation and wanted no part in it. To Misook, that silence was no different from complicity. Then came the final crack, and it proved fatal. About 2 months before the murder, Misook was caught stealing 2 items of clothing from a shopping mall. She was taken to the police station and needed a family member to post bail. It wasn't the first time. She'd shoplifted repeatedly before, even though her family wasn't struggling financially, and Linda often bought her things far more expensive than anything she stole. Each time, the family had quietly stepped in to handle the consequences. But not this time. Neither Don Wang nor Linda came to help her. They were too ashamed and wanted her, for once, to face the consequences of her own actions and learn from them. Misook carried that resentment with her. The first thing she did after being released was drain the couple's joint bank account of tens of thousands of dollars. When Linda found out, she angrily confronted her again and again and again, demanding that the money be returned. Misook refused. The 2 women began arguing constantly. and then Don Wang raised the possibility of divorce. At that point, the entire picture fell into place. Her mother-in-law had cut off her financial support. Her husband wanted a divorce. Her shop no longer had anyone backing it. Everything Misook had accumulated over 8 years was slipping out of her hands at the same time, and she blamed it all on one person. There was one more detail, and it came from Misook herself. While being held in jail awaiting trial, she wrote a letter in Korean to a family member, perhaps believing that no one would be able to read it. But all mail entering and leaving the jail was inspected, and the letter was translated. In it, Misook mentioned Linda's life insurance policy, which had a payout of $250,000. Don Wang was the beneficiary, and Misook wrote that if they divorced, she would be entitled to half of that money. Sooner or later, even the best hidden truth comes to light. The trial took place in December 2012 in McLean County Circuit Court. Before the trial began, Misook pleaded guilty to concealment of homicidal death. She continued to insist, however, that Linda's death had resulted from an act of self-defense. Through tears, she testified that she'd been too afraid to call the police because she feared losing custody of her 5-year-old son. But the jury didn't believe her. On December 18, 2012, the jury found Misook Nowlin Wang guilty of first-degree murder. On March 1, 2013, the judge imposed the sentence 50 years for murder, plus another 5 years for concealment of homicidal death, for a total of 55 years in prison. She was 47 years old at the time, meaning she wouldn't become eligible for release until sometime in the mid-2060s, when she'd already be in her 90s. In other words, it was a life sentence written in numbers. The story should have ended there, but it did not. When the case appeared in the newspapers, a man inside an Illinois state prison read the name Misook Nowlin and felt his entire body turn cold. His name was Barton McNeil. And since 1999, he'd been serving what amounted to nearly a life sentence after being convicted of murdering his own 3-year-old daughter, Christina, inside a rented home in Bloomington on a night in June 1998. For all those years, he had maintained his innocence. And from the very beginning, he had named one person, his former girlfriend, the woman he'd broken up with less than 12 hours before his daughter died. That woman was Misook. After Misook was convicted in 2012, 2 innocence organizations began working on Barton McNeil's case. In 2023, Misook was called to court to testify. There, she refused to answer almost every question. There was only one she agreed to answer. When asked directly whether she had killed Christina, she said no. That case remains unresolved to this day. Courts at multiple levels have repeatedly denied McNeil's request for a new trial, and on October 2, 2025, the Illinois Supreme Court also declined to hear the case. Barton McNeil therefore remains in prison. But the most haunting part of this story centers on someone else. Larry Tyda, the husband who lost his wife at Misook's hands, followed every development in McNeil's case and publicly came to his defense. He believes the man is innocent. He attended court hearings and told the press that he hoped Barton would receive a new trial because he deserved that chance. The person who lost the most in this entire story became the one willing to speak on behalf of a man the system still considered a murderer. Linda Tyda spent more than 20 years speaking for people who couldn't speak for themselves. Yet it was that very kindness and that same devotion to her profession that Misook used to lure her from her home. Sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from a stranger hiding in the darkness. Sometimes it sits at your own dinner table, calls you mom, and smiles. Had investigators done a more thorough job in 1998, would Linda have been killed 13 years later? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story worth following, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the cases still to come. Goodbye, and I'll see you next time.